Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be checking out the cult at Cherry Essa Farm. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but if I pronounced it wrong, I'm sorry. But it's another Ready or Not lore video by Isaac, and thank you again for giving me permission before. And of course, if you enjoy this video, then make sure to support the original video. And if you do enjoy my reaction to it, then be sure to give it a like, comment down below, subscribe, and share, okay? Now let's get started.
Ready or Not has no shortage of unnerving scenarios and locations. You don't have to look any further than the third mission if you're looking for an experience that'll really creep you out. But there's only been one level that's made me feel as if I were actually playing a horror game. Its setting and enemies and story all feel so otherworldly and spooky. And the mission itself doesn't feel too far off from a
Wait, is this the cult one?
I'm talking, of course, about the Carriers of the Vine cult at Cherry Essa Farms. Now, for
finally,
all intents and purposes, Cherry Essa Farms seems to be locally known as the creepy cult place. I mean, it's mentioned right in our report that over the years there's been all these rumors and stories about what happens at the farm. But until now, nobody has really been exactly sure what goes on in there. From the outside in, it appears to be just a rundown, overgrown family farm. And aside from a makeshift gun range and a strange symbol out front, nothing seems to be too out of the ordinary. That is, until we receive a call forcing our arrival to the scene. Now, prior to our arrival, we're told in a briefing that there's been a shootout between the people at the farm and the local police. Evidently, some of the cult members had driven into town and assaulted a man at a gun store before driving off and heading back to their compound. Local police managed to track down the vehicle's license plate and found the address to be registered at Cherry Essa Family Vineyards. Now, two local cops, Garcia and Perez, arrived to the farm, where their squad car is promptly fired upon, forcing them to crash into a fence before even reaching the front door. Sergeant Perez is killed in the ensuing gunfight. And at the time of her call to dispatch, Officer Garcia is pinned down by gunfire. Now, when we arrive, we see none of this. I think it's assumed that as we pull up, we manage to get a hold of them, because seeing as all of this went down right next to the entrance, and you can't find either of these officers anywhere on the map, I think it's implied that we managed to extract both of the officers. But anyway,
that's good.
We're dealing with a very hostile cult here, and our mission is to bust into their compound, rescue any civilians, and arrest the ringleader of whatever is happening here. Now, shortly upon our arrival at the scene, we can quickly realize that this cult is entirely female-based. The symbol that we see throughout the property is actually just an altered version of the female gender symbol, and all of the people that we encounter on this map
That's interesting.
women,
That's a all-female cult.
is pretty interesting. If you follow true crime at all, you would probably know that the vast majority of violent crimes are committed by males. So having a violent group of women committing all of these crimes is a pretty unique circumstance. Anyways, though,
I do agree that it's quite unique, especially in media. Like when you think of a cult type of like movie or even in regular TV shows and dramas and whatnot, and I'm not even like including cartoons or anime or whatever that have some kind of cult thing going on, it's usually a male leader that tends to be the ringleader of the cult, and then they, perform really bad kind of acts or crimes against their cult members. And you know how cults are. They're very scary. Like once you're in, it's very difficult for you to leave because of how much they brainwash you and the people around you, to the point that you feel like you have no way to escape. They're very, I guess, good at manipulation, which is the most terrifying thing. And it's like systematically done so that by the time you realize something's wrong, it's going to be a huge struggle of trying to leave. So seeing this case where we actually have females as the majority of the members, and I'm not sure if the ringleader is also female, but it's very intriguing that the sign of the cult is also female, because usually they make in like shows the guy who is the ringleader tends to be seen as like God or something along those lines, which I believe is quite common amongst media portrayal of cults. I'm not sure how accurate it is for in real life cults, but I do find it intriguing that it usually tends to be that instead of a female. which I'm pretty sure there probably is a female cult, or at least one whose leader is female. You let me know if you have like information about that. I would be very interested to see if there is something like that, or if this all-female cult thing is actually extremely rare to see in any media or even in real life.
As we begin our entrance into the house, in addition to the typical cult paraphernalia that we'd expect, we also start to see a couple of different patterns. For instance, most, if not all, of the decorations in the house depict women, which tracks, Seeing as this is a female cult, it would make sense that they'd be really big on female iconography, right?
That's
However, there
true.
are actually a few times that we'll see men in these paintings, and in
They
nearly
seem all dead.
all of them, the man is being subjected to castration. In fact, the theme of castration is present in some of the other paintings too, which is very concerning to say the least. But just put that knowledge in the back of your mind for right now.
Castration,
It's going to be important later. We also begin to notice a pattern in the books that we see lying around. For instance, we see a book labeled Human Anatomy, and later we'll find ones more focused around healthcare and psychology. And seeing these
I don't know if you guys have like a similar show, but there was this Korean drama that I watched a long time ago where it was about you follow like this group of team, like it's a team that focuses on solving cases that have to do with really rare diseases. And one of the episodes that I've watched, and I remember it very clearly, I think it was like when I was in middle school, high school-ish that I watched it when I was younger, but there was a case where this kid came in because he had a rare disease, which you can only get this, or no, it was a dead body, and it was a young person who had a rare disease and died from it. And they needed to figure out how on earth he got this disease. But this particular disease is something that you get when you eat human flesh. Apparently you have like a bacteria or something that eats you from inside out, and that's how you die from it. But it's really rare to find it like in modern society. So they had to look into it because it's not like there were any cannibals in Korea, at least in the show. I don't think there is really in real life either. It would have to be in certain tribes or in other countries, I would assume. But in the case, you find out that the cult actually scavenges dead bodies and even and makes like their believers eat the flesh because it supposedly helps them cure whatever illness or bad luck that they have. And that was something that kind of traumatized me when I was younger, when I was watching it. But it was a very interesting case. And when I see the whole body anatomy and healthcare stuff, it just really reminds me of that case. That was a really good show, though. I forgot the name of it.
Sorts of medical related books after what we saw in the paintings is sort of starting to paint a picture that I'm not all that fond of. But anyways, we continue to clear out the building and investigate it. As we move from room to room, we can begin to see that most of the women here are abiding by a dress code. Aside from just two of them, all of the women seem to wear shaved hairstyles, white dresses, and vine tattoos covering their arms. Now, dress codes are typically seen as a way for cults to break down a person's individuality. After all, limiting a person's self-expression is a great way to keep them obedient. In addition, a dress code can also help to differentiate the levels of power that a particular member holds. And as such, we can find two women that instead of white are wearing the color red. And these two just so happen to be the main suspects that we're after. The first is the leader of the group, a woman named Elaine Raskin. Now, Elaine is a former USIA
female leader
who was discharged for undisclosed reasons. And over time, she would begin to develop these sorts of misandrous tendencies. Before long, those tendencies evolved into a full-fledged hatred of men, which eventually led to the founding of her ideology. Now, to be honest, I'm not all that sure where this hatred arose. Most of the other women seem to have more private vendettas against men that personally attacked them, but Elaine's hatred seems to run much deeper than that. My best guess is that she saw something disturbing during her time working with the government, and that's what led to her radicalization. Now, the other woman in red is Eve Nader, who had been reported missing by her family over a decade ago. Eve had been a constant victim of domestic violence and sought refuge at a women's shelter. carried the Crisis LLC, and the owner of this shelter was none other than Elaine Raskin. Now, this shelter is eventually shut down for obvious reasons, and that's when Elaine rebrands it into the Carriers of the Vine cult. Over time, Elaine has managed to brainwash and groom Eve into becoming the perfect cult member, and it would appear that she's starting to do the same to several others. When we make our way into Elaine's quarters, we can find yet another one of these graphic paintings, as well as some chains, a bowl, and several severed human fingers. Anyways, aside from all of this, the room doesn't really have anything of consequence. We only start to find out what's really going on here when we make our way into Eve's room. The walls are adorned with labeled portraits of men, surrounded by newspaper clippings and photos. All of the men featured on this wall are noted as being horrific monsters, some being sex criminals and others being violent wife beaters. Based on what we see here, it would appear that the women of this cult have been planning revenge attacks on the men that assaulted them. For instance, one of the men on the board stands accused of using date rape drugs at a local nightclub, and when his victims aren't lucid enough to defend themselves, he kidnaps and sexually assaults them. The conspiracy board goes on to suggest that the women of this cult plan on kidnapping him and taking him back to their compound and chopping his manhood off. But anyways, for now we need to set aside our judgments because we still have a job to do. Although we've already arrested Elaine and Eve, there's still an entire side of the property that we haven't cleared yet. So we make our way outside and into the courtyard.
That makes me terrified.
The courtyard and beyond is probably one of the more surreal areas of this game. It's, to me, where this mission starts to feel as though we're in a bit too deep. Right in the center of the courtyard is a massive shrine of the symbol that we've seen earlier. It sits atop a bed of flowers and tree limbs, and just below it sits the skull of a longhorn. Immediately to the left of it is a sniper's nest, and to the right sits a sort of barracks area for some of the cult members. Down below is also a pretty expansive wine cellar that you'll need to clear, but none of these areas hold anything of any real consequence. Instead, we'll continue out past the courtyard to find two distinct paths, one which leads to the left and another that goes further back into the woods. For now though,
I get the feeling that a lot of their, I guess, operations, not really the squad, but I mean like the cult itself, they would probably want to do it like in the woods where it's not, where I guess essentially their compound wouldn't be tainted by males, I would assume. It would be their logic, but I guess we'll see.
We'll ignore the path left and we'll focus on the one in front of us. As we work our way back through the woods, we see yet another one of these makeshift shrines. What had at first felt like an oddity on this mission has now become commonplace. When we look past the shrine though, we find ourselves in front of a dilapidated church. If we walk to the right and up to the second level, we'll find ourselves in the congregation room. Beyond the empty pews and rows of vines, we find a statue carved out of a tree, which is growing up and out of the church. This room right here is what made me initially draw the Resident Evil connection, because you can't really look at this and feel like you're not in a horror game. But anyways, I'm not too sure what the statue here is supposed to depict. I hypothesize that it's the Greek goddess Hera, who is the goddess of women.
Medusa.
Reason being, I wouldn't find it too out of the ordinary for a feminine cult like this to worship the goddess of women. It makes sense. Also, we can find a portrait of Medusa sitting in Elaine's room, so it's obvious that they've got some sort of interest in Greek mythology. But at the same time, I'm not well versed on it myself, so please take that with a grain of salt. But anyways, we can see bloody handprints going down the base of this statue. And when we make our way down into the lower level, we find what can only be described as a torture chamber. Along the floors are chains and metal collars bolted to the walls. Next to them sits empty food bowls, and if you look closely, you can see blood stains covering the walls next to them. On one side sits a dog cage, and on the other appears to be wooden stocks. The further we investigate the room, the clearer the picture starts to become. We find a car battery and jumper cables, a hammer, a knife, and a sickle. Now the sickle is especially important because if you don't remember, that was the primary tool that we saw in all of those different paintings around the house. And given the context of the situation and what we've seen prior, it's safe to assume that the women of this cult drag their victims here, beat them, torture them, and eventually castrate and kill them. And considering that
I don't know what's worse, eating a dead body or torturing people and killing them. Let me know below what you think is probably slightly better. Not that both of them are good, because they all suck, but I don't know. Pick your poison type of situation, I guess. I mean, obviously we wouldn't join one or even do any of that, but yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this.
There are no men currently down here, and there are massive puddles of blood. I can only guess that they've already gone through several people. And this suspicion is confirmed when we head back towards the courtyard and take the other path that we passed earlier, where we see four shallow graves dug next to an outhouse. Placed on each of these graves are little twigs formed in the shape of the cult symbol, and in one of the graves we can see a shovel still planted upright, suggesting that these men were buried very recently. So the cult has thus far killed at least 5 people that we know of. There was the police officer in the shootout, and then these 4 graves that we see here. Now, my opinions on this situation are wildly conflicting, right? On one hand, I can sort of understand where these women were coming from. Many of them were subjected to the worst type of abuse imaginable, and that's the sort of thing that haunts people for life. And many of these same women saw their attackers just continue to go on with their lives, facing no real repercussions for the pain that they inflicted. And although I can't imagine that feeling, I can understand their desire to want to get revenge. Now, on the other hand, I think that all of these women are batshit fucking crazy. I mean, you can quickly gather that from just walking around the property.
I think what makes it even more tragic is the fact that because they were subjected to so much abuse and unimaginable pain, and then seeing the people that they hate that cause them the pain to live a happy life, it can make someone go into very dark places mentally. And then there's someone who apparently is a savior and will help them get their revenge. It's hard for them to say no at that point. And especially if they're already broken inside, then there's no way that they can understand that a cult is a bad thing and that this person doesn't actually have the best interests for them. In fact, they are the ones brainwashing and manipulating them and using their pain. And instead of healing them, they chose to distort them further. So in the end, instead of becoming someone good who can prevent other women from getting injured or preventing more pain from spreading throughout the world, they instead are inflicting more pain. And violence breeds more violence. And unfortunately, although I really understand, I truly do understand how much they would want to get revenge on people who abuse them or hurt them like this. But in the end, instead of doing it for themselves, they're doing it for a cult, which I feel like is probably worse in some ways. Because if it was just individually that they themselves getting revenge, okay, I get it. Like, I do understand. Obviously, it's not a good thing to do, but I do understand. But if they're being manipulated by a cult to do more crimes beyond the revenge, their own personal revenge, then that's something that's not really like, I understand where they were coming from in the beginning, but at that point, you're basically a lost cause. I mean, obviously you could still escape from the, cult and then eventually redeem yourself throughout your life, and maybe by going into prison and then eventually leaving and then trying to help people, not as a cult, but as a person who genuinely wants to make sure others don't end up like them. That's more of I guess, a better outcome, ideal outcome. Obviously, that's not going to be the case for a lot of people, but cults are not the answer to things. And it really breaks my heart that instead of becoming free, they end up contributing to the cycle.
The women were all working through their trauma legally and still doing some of the weird pagan-y stuff. I really wouldn't have a problem with it. But when you start having bloody castration rituals and killing people and shooting cops and stuff, that's when you start to lose me. I think that the real tragedy in all of this is that a lot of these traumatized women were taken advantage of, not only by abusive men, but also the systems that were supposed to be in place to help them. Elaine Raskin's cult started off as a battered women's shelter. and over time evolved into a violent extremist ideology. She managed to convince her followers that these heinous acts were healthy and okay, and in the process, she ruined the lives of countless recovering women. Cherryessa is yet another chapter of exploitation that we see in Ready or Not. It's obvious that this is just a smaller part of something much larger going on within the game, and perhaps later in this series we can begin to draw more connections between these stories and see how they relate with one another. At the end of the day though, I think that Cherryessa Farms is one of the best moral dilemmas presented in Ready or Not, and overall just a really unsettling map. But I'd love to hear your all's thoughts on it. Do you think that the cult had any sort of redeeming qualities, or were they just a bunch of crazies? You be the judge. But anyways though, I really appreciate you guys tuning in and watching today's video. You know I love you. I'm out.
So I do think that if like he said, if the cult was just doing some weird things but nothing that's harming others, then it would have been acceptable to some degree. I mean, cults themselves in general are not really a good thing because it ruins your sense of individuality and ability to think for yourself. But at least with that, it's helping others recover. But if you're killing people and doing violent acts, and this includes violent doesn't mean I guess it could be like in a sexual manner too, but also like just actual death or killing or abusing others and manipulating, that kind of stuff, mental, emotional, physical abuse. If it's going to that degree, then obviously it's not going to be a good thing. And like you said, as we already know, these people were already victims and they were trying to recover, but instead of actually recovering, they ended up getting taken advantage of regardless. And that's the most tragic part of this case. Just because one person felt like their hatred for males was righteous and what should be done, it doesn't mean that this applies to all men, you know? But it feels like if they didn't stop this cult right then and there, then it could have been extended to all men instead of just the men that, abused them. And that's a very, very dangerous slope to try to go on. Trying to kill off an entire gender is not really the right thing to do. So in some ways, it's a very tragic case. I don't think there's any redeeming qualities of it because they basically ruined other women's lives for their own hatred and biases. And now, thankfully, since we stopped them, hopefully now they can actually properly recover, whether it's in prison or not. But knowing what humans are like within the game world, since obviously this isn't real life, although the topic itself is very related to real life, I do believe that there may be some who may end up trying to make the cult happen again. Because some people are just not able to break out of the cycle, and if they suffered, then of course others should suffer, is pretty much their biggest stubborn opinion, even though technically they should be trying to make sure next generations and people like them don't end up like them. So that's one of the things that I found to be extremely depressing, but also very realistic in a sense for Ready or Not. And again, I've been really enjoying the cases that I've been seeing so far, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more. There's just something humbling about watching the Ready or Not videos and learning about the cases themselves. It reminds you and grounds you that this is actually reality to some people. Like, you might not be able to experience it yourself in your real life, which is a good thing. But for many, this is actually their reality. It seems surreal, but to others, surreal is their life, and it's not rosy or idealistic or amazing. It's horrible. It's a very horrible experience, and no one should have to go through that, but there's just a lot of bad people, but just like that, there's also a lot of good people. And it's always good to remind yourself that this is a reality to some in order to continue having empathy for others instead of ignoring and turning a blind eye towards people's pain and suffering just because you yourself never experienced it. I believe games like this have a powerful way of allowing others to gain more empathy. And that's one of the great things that gaming can do, is to provide you another way to understand others' lives or being in their shoes, essentially. Because some people do have a hard time trying to relate or understand, or they may not even try to understand. Like, if I'm suffering, then who cares? That's what some people tend to think as well, which I think is wrong. So I really enjoyed this episode or this video, and I'm looking forward to watching more. And of course, if you enjoyed it too, then make sure to support the original video. And if you enjoyed my reaction to it, then make sure to give it a like, comment below, subscribe, and share. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.